The moment my wife moved in, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted, not for us, but for them. Up until that point, the HOA had always been coldly polite, the kind of group that waved with tight smiles and sent passive-aggressive emails about garbage bins left out 10 minutes too long. But something about my wife's arrival struck a nerve. Maybe it was the fact that she was younger than they expected, or that she had a sharp confidence in her stride. Maybe it was her skin tone, or the way she didn't play by their unspoken rules of submission. Whatever it was, the change was immediate. The morning she arrived, we were unloading boxes from the back of my truck. She was smiling, excited, wearing old jeans and a hoodie, looking like any woman settling into a new chapter of life. We weren't making noise. We weren't blocking the street, but I could feel the eyes on us. Curtains fluttered. Someone peeked out from their garage. And then came the first encounter, Karen. Not her real name, of course, but the title she earned in the way she marched up with a clipboard, sunglasses too big for her face, and a tone that dripped with entitlement. "Excuse me," she said, not even looking at me. "Can I ask what's going on here?" I responded, a bit confused. "We're just moving in. This is my wife." Karen didn't look at my wife. She just narrowed her eyes and said, "There's been no notice given to the HOA about a new resident. Has she filled out the residency form? Background check? Approval process?" I told her there was no such requirement in the bylaws. I'd read them myself before closing on the house. There was nothing about notifying anyone about a spouse moving in. But Karen wouldn't back down. She insisted the community had a process and that every permanent occupant needed to be approved. My wife, standing next to me with a box in her hands, raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet. She had already sensed what this was about. It wasn't about forms. It wasn't about rules. It was about control, about territory, about a woman like Karen feeling she had some kind of power over people she didn't approve of. Later that afternoon, a notice was taped to our front door, an official HOA letter citing unauthorized occupancy and threatening a fine of $500 a day until the matter was resolved. It wasn't signed by the board, just by Karen, calling herself the interim neighborhood compliance officer. We laughed at first. It seemed ridiculous, a joke. But the more we thought about it, the more it became clear that Karen wasn't just bluffing. She was testing us, seeing if we'd fold, if we'd pack up, if we'd be intimidated enough to ask for permission to live in our own home. The next morning, my wife went for a walk around the block and got followed by a neighbor in a golf cart. They didn't say anything, just tailed her slowly, turning every time she turned, watching her like she didn't belong. She came home calm, but I could tell it rattled her. We weren't just dealing with a nosy neighbor. We were dealing with a pattern, a subtle, persistent hostility disguised as rules and procedure. A few hours later, my wife received an email from the HOA address, clearly written by Karen, demanding proof of marriage and a utility bill in her name. The tone was smug, as if they were building a case, trying to create a paper trail to use against us. It was chilling in its precision, like this was something they had done before. And that's when we knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was targeted, personal, and very likely discriminatory. Karen didn't ask for proof of residency when the Johnsons' adult son moved back home. She didn't send forms when the newlyweds 2 doors down got married and moved in together last summer. No, this wasn't about rules. This was about my wife, who she was, what she represented, and what Karen couldn't control. It was about drawing a line in the sand and daring us to step over it. My wife wasn't intimidated. She stayed calm. She gathered every interaction, every letter, every time-stamped photo of her being followed or watched. She knew exactly what they were doing, and she also knew something they didn't. She was prepared. She had dealt with people like this before. It happened less than 24 hours after my wife moved in. We were still surrounded by half-open boxes, deciding where to hang the art and figuring out which drawer would be for utensils. It should have been a quiet evening of building a home, of starting fresh. Instead, it turned into a scene, a siren-filled, flashing light, full-on escalation, because Karen, in her infinite self-importance, decided the presence of my wife in our own home constituted an emergency worthy of 911. It started with a knock on the door around 7 p.m. A loud, urgent knock, not the kind you get from a neighbor dropping off cookies. It was sharp, official. I opened the door, and there they were, 2 police officers standing on our front porch, one already adjusting his body cam, the other with a flashlight at his side. Behind them, Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, her phone still in her hand, smirking like she'd done the right thing. Like she was the neighborhood hero. "Sir," one officer said, "we received a call about a possible domestic dispute or break-in at this address. Can we come inside and talk?" I was stunned, speechless for a second. I looked at my wife, who had come to the doorway behind me, drying her hands from doing dishes. She looked confused but calm, already sensing what had happened. I turned back to the officer. "A break-in? This is our home." The officer didn't seem aggressive, but he was firm. "We just need to make sure everything's okay. Mind if we step inside?" I'll let them in. We had nothing to hide. My wife welcomed them politely, offering to show ID. One officer glanced around the room, taking in the clutter of a recent move, the boxes labeled kitchen, the takeout containers on the table, the picture frames still leaning against the wall waiting to be hung. Nothing remotely violent, nothing threatening. Just the quiet chaos of 2 people starting a life together. They asked a few routine questions. "Who lives here? How long have you been here? Are you married? Do you have proof of residence?" We answered them all without hesitation. My wife handed over her driver's license, which still had her old address, but we had mail in her name, a marriage certificate, even a mortgage statement with both our names on it. All the while, Karen lingered outside, pretending to water a bush that didn't need watering, peering in from the sidewalk, trying to act casual. One of the officers finally stepped outside to talk to her. We could hear snippets, phrases like "no sign of distress," "not our jurisdiction," and "seems like a misunderstanding." But we both knew it wasn't. Kara hadn't called 911 because she thought someone was in danger. She called because she couldn't stand that my wife had moved in without her permission. Because we didn't ask. Because we didn't explain ourselves to her. In her mind, calling the police was just another extension of her authority, another way to intimidate and exert control. To her, it was a power move, a scare tactic. She wanted to make a statement. "You don't belong here unless I say so." The irony was thick. She had accused my wife of being unauthorized, of somehow invading the neighborhood, and yet she was the one wasting emergency services over her own personal grudge. She couldn't stand being ignored, and so she tried to make it into something criminal. In doing so, she exposed not just her prejudice, but her recklessness. Who calls 911 for that? Who weaponizes law enforcement just because they don't like the look of someone unloading groceries in a shared driveway? The officers eventually apologized for the inconvenience. They were professional, even slightly embarrassed. One of them muttered, "We get calls like this sometimes in HOAs. Usually it's just neighbor drama." He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he understood what this was. And I could see in his eyes that he didn't agree with it. But still, they had to respond. A 911 call meant procedure, a report, a check-in. And Karen knew that. That was her whole plan. As they walked back to their cruiser, Karen tried to intercept them, speaking in a low, fake concerned tone. She gestured toward our house, waving her arms slightly, still trying to paint herself as the victim. But the officers didn't stick around long. They gave her a few short replies, then drove off. Inside, my wife sat on the couch, unbothered on the surface, but quiet, processing everything. Not surprised, just reminded. Reminded that for some people, control matters more than truth, and appearance matters more than facts. For Karen, the rules weren't about safety. They were about power. And when that power was ignored, she pulled out the only weapon she thought could still make her feel important, a phone call to 911. When the police officers stepped into our living room, they looked around as if trying to piece together a puzzle that wasn't even real. The atmosphere was calm, quiet, the kind of peaceful mess you'd expect in a house, still halfway through unpacking. My wife had just lit a candle in the kitchen. A mellow jazz playlist was drifting from a speaker in the corner. A cup of tea sat on the side table beside her, untouched. It was absurd, watching two uniformed officers try to assess a domestic disturbance in the middle of what looked like a Sunday evening in a Pottery Barn catalog. They were polite but alert, as officers often are when walking into an unknown situation. One asked for identification. My wife calmly handed over her driver's license. I gave mine too. The officer asked how long we had been living in the house. I told him I bought it 2 years ago and that my wife had just moved in after our wedding. He nodded slowly and scribbled something in a small notepad. The second officer asked if we had proof of marriage. It felt surreal. Proof? We were standing in our home, surrounded by our shared belongings. But my wife didn't blink. She walked over to one of the half-unpacked boxes and pulled out a folder labeled Important Documents. Inside was our marriage certificate, neatly sealed in a plastic sleeve. She handed it over, and the officer looked it over without a word. They asked if there had been any arguments, raised voices, disturbances of any kind. I said no. They asked if anyone else lived in the house. I said no, just us. They looked around again, as if waiting for something to jump out, something to justify their presence. There was nothing. No broken glass. No shouting. No signs of chaos. Just a couple, in their home, being asked to explain why they were there. The absurdity of it all began to settle in. This wasn't just about a neighbor being overly cautious. It wasn't about confusion. It was about accusation. Someone had deliberately told 911 that something serious was happening here. Something urgent enough for 2 officers to show up within minutes. And when those officers entered, they were expecting conflict. They had been led to believe they were walking into danger. But there was no threat, no evidence of any issue. Only the faint smell of lavender from the candle and the rustling of cardboard as we tried to make a home. One of the officers stepped outside to speak with the caller. We knew it was Karen. She had been watching from the sidewalk, arms crossed, pretending she wasn't directly involved even though she had been the one who placed the call. The other officer stayed behind and tried to keep the mood light. He asked how long we'd been married, if we were new to the neighborhood. It felt like small talk meant to fill time while they figured out how to de-escalate the situation. Eventually, the first officer came back inside. He said everything looked in order and that they wouldn't be taking any further action. But he added, almost apologetically, that since a 911 call had been made, there would still be a written report on the incident. It was standard protocol. He emphasized that nothing negative was going on record, that it was just documentation, nothing to worry about. My wife and I exchanged glances. We weren't worried, but we were angry. Not in a yelling, explosive way, in the quiet, simmering way that comes when someone disrespects your existence without ever raising their voice. We had done nothing wrong. We hadn't even finished moving in. And yet here we were, being documented in a police report simply because a neighbor decided we didn't belong. Karen remained outside for a few more minutes, pretending to sweep her porch in long, deliberate strokes while keeping one eye on the scene. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to make sure we knew she had power. That was what this was really about. Not safety, not concern, control, image. She wanted us to feel watched, to feel like outsiders, even in our own space. The officers left soon after. No tickets, no citations, no further questions, just a generic stay safe and a nod before the cruiser pulled away. The flashing lights vanished, and the street fell quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. But something had happened. Not in the legal sense, maybe, but in the human one. A line had been crossed, a boundary of decency, of neighborly respect, of simple dignity. And we both knew it wouldn't be the last time. As soon as the police left and the dust from Karen's 911 stunt had settled, my wife sat back on the couch, calm, collected, and unshaken. But I could tell something had shifted, not in a fearful way, far from it. It was more like a quiet resolve, the kind that builds when someone realizes they've been underestimated and decides it's time to respond. She didn't vent or pace or rant. She simply stood up, went to the dining table, pulled her laptop from her bag, and began typing with quiet precision. It was the look of a woman who had dealt with nonsense before, but now had reason to go to work. What Karen and the rest of the HOA board didn't realize was that my wife wasn't just a homeowner or a newlywed or someone you could push around with fake rules and veiled threats. She was a licensed attorney, a sharp one, not a divorce lawyer, not a personal injury billboard face, but a legal mind with courtroom experience and a specialty in housing and civil rights. She had spent years fighting for tenants wrongfully evicted, for families discriminated against by landlords and boards, for people targeted simply for being in the wrong neighborhood. She had seen all the Karen tricks before, only now it was personal. Karen had been treating my wife like a pushover, like some random woman who had married into the neighborhood and hadn't earned her place. That was her mistake, because while Karen had a clipboard and a self-appointed title, my wife had a bar card and a file of case law that made HOA complaints look like playground squabbles. The first thing she did was begin documenting everything. Every email, every text, the timestamp video of the police showing up, the statements they made, the false claim on the 911 call, even screenshots of Karen outside pretending to sweep while spying on us. She knew what to look for, the language of bias, the patterns of harassment, the manipulation of policy. She pulled out the HOA bylaws and started highlighting. Every section Karen had twisted, every rule that had been applied unequally, every spot where her demands contradicted written policy. Then she checked the public records for HOA board meeting minutes. It was all online. She found notes referencing community integrity, unexpected residents, and concerns about non-compliant behavior. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't have to be. The tone was clear. The subtext was loaded, and she knew exactly how to read between the lines. She reached out to a couple of colleagues, quietly, just enough to confirm some legal angles. One of them had litigated a similar case involving a discriminatory HOA in a neighboring county. They compared notes. My wife took it all in with calm, laser focus. She wasn't rushing toward revenge or trying to humiliate anyone. She was building a case brick by brick, methodically, because this wasn't just about us. It was about a pattern she recognized all too well, those subtle, systemic tactics that let people like Karen maintain control over neighborhoods through intimidation masked as policy. Later that day, she printed a stack of documents, neatly stapled, perfectly aligned. She drafted a letter addressed to the HOA board, citing specific sections of the Fair Housing Act and warning of their potential liability for discriminatory enforcement of occupancy rules. She outlined the events of the past 48 hours with lawyer-grade detail. Objective, factual, irrefutable. No emotional flourishes. Just the facts, laid out like a closing argument. But she didn't send it. Not yet. She wanted to do it in person. She knew it would hit harder, and she wanted Karen to see her not just as a problem, but as the person holding all the power now. What Karen had seen was a woman moving boxes, unloading groceries, keeping quiet during an ambush. What she hadn't seen was a woman who had argued before judges, who had drafted civil complaints that made landlords panic, who had the poise to sit through an unlawful confrontation and still stay 5 steps ahead. My wife had let Karen play her cards first. Now it was her turn. That evening, while we were eating dinner, my wife got another email from the HOA address, again unsigned, again full of veiled demands. It asked her to cease unauthorized presence on community property and warned of escalating fines. That was the final piece she needed. The wording was sloppy, vague, legally useless, but damning. She smiled slightly, folded her napkin, and said, "Now we escalate properly." It was just after 2 p.m. the next day when Karen's perfect little world was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. Not a delivery truck, not a neighbor dropping by, but a sleek black sedan government plates, tinted windows, and the kind of quiet engine hum that says official business. My wife had made one phone call that morning, and now, standing outside our house with a folder in hand and sunglasses on, she watched calmly as the woman who thought she ruled the neighborhood opened her door in a confused daze. Karen wasn't expecting company. She especially wasn't expecting to be served. A woman stepped out of the car, dressed in professional black slacks and a tailored blazer, holding a single manila envelope. She walked briskly up to Karen's porch, rang the bell once, and asked for her by name. Karen confirmed it, still confused, still in that flustered tone of someone who senses something is wrong but hasn't figured it out yet. That's when the woman handed her the envelope and said, very clearly, "You've been served." Karen didn't even take it right away. She hesitated, like maybe if she refused to touch it, it wouldn't be real. But the moment she heard the phrase unlawful harassment, civil rights violation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, her hand slowly moved to accept the envelope. The door stayed open just long enough for the entire block to see what had happened. It was poetic. My wife hadn't filed a lawsuit yet, but she had drafted and delivered a cease and desist paired with a notice of intent, one that carried legal weight and made it clear she was fully prepared to move forward with litigation if the HOA continued their behavior. She outlined the violations with surgical precision, including every legal reference necessary to show that this wasn't just a bluff. It was real, it was personal, and it was coming with teeth. Inside the envelope was a notarized letter addressed, not just to Karen, but to the HOA board as a whole. It stated that their actions over the past 48 hours, including the false 911 report, the discriminatory language in the notices, the harassment during neighborhood walks, and the misuse of HOA power, had triggered violations of both state and federal housing laws. It demanded immediate cessation of all further threats, revocation of any fines issued, and a formal apology delivered in writing. Failure to comply would result in the initiation of a civil suit in county court, with the possibility of a federal complaint filed under the Fair Housing Act. What made it even more effective was the way my wife had worded it. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was clinical, cold, focused. She attached copies of all communications, video stills from the police visit, and transcripts of what had been said on record. She made it impossible to argue against, impossible to brush off as some neighbor dispute. This was law now. This was evidence, procedure, leverage. Karen's expression, as she stood there on the porch clutching that envelope, changed slowly, from disbelief to confusion, then to panic. She tried to ask the process server what it was about, but the woman had already turned and was walking back to the car. No explanation needed. The document said everything. From our front window, we watched as Karen stood frozen on her porch, flipping through the pages like she couldn't believe what she was reading. Her posture sagged. Her eyes darted back toward our house, as if expecting someone to come out and explain. But we didn't. We just watched in silence. Within 20 minutes, emails started flying. My wife received a message from the HOA's general inbox asking if perhaps a misunderstanding had occurred and if we would be open to a conversation to resolve any perceived issues. My wife didn't respond right away. She wanted them to sit with it, to realize that this wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about consequence. Later that afternoon, a notice was hand-delivered to our mailbox from the HOA secretary, a different tone entirely from the ones Karen had sent. It expressed regret for any offense caused, promised that all previous warnings would be rescinded, and asked for a meeting to review community guidelines in a spirit of cooperation. It was clearly damage control, carefully worded to avoid admitting fault while also trying to de-escalate. But the damage had already been done. Karen had used every ounce of power she thought she had, and in less than a day, it had all been neutralized. Not with yelling, not with threats, but with paperwork, precedent, and the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly how to use the law. After the legal notice was served and Karen's illusion of control began to unravel, the entire HOA shifted its tone. Suddenly, the people who had watched in silence were now peeking over fences and giving half-smiles when they saw us. The ones who had stood behind Karen's leadership, or at least tolerated it, were beginning to realize that the foundation she had built her power on was fragile. And now that it had cracked, nobody wanted to stand too close. But for us, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because what we had experienced wasn't just a personal slight. It was discrimination, plain and simple. And my wife had every intention of making sure it never happened to another family again. She began assembling the full case file, not to intimidate, but to expose. She gathered every HOA meeting agenda from the last year, every newsletter, every policy memo. She found patterns, subtle language choices, selective enforcement of rules, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared when submitted by certain residents. And then she found it. 2 separate cases where other homeowners, both white and longtime residents, had added roommates or live-in partners without notifying the board, and no action had ever been taken. No fines, no letters, no sudden compliance checks. She wasn't surprised. This kind of selective enforcement was exactly what the Fair Housing Act was designed to prevent. She documented everything, cross-referenced the violations, and started to build a formal complaint to file with the state housing department. Her goal wasn't revenge. It was reform, the kind that only comes when misconduct is made public and accountable. At the same time, we started hearing stories from other neighbors, quietly, cautiously, in passing. One woman admitted Karen had reported her teenage son for loitering near the park bench on his own front lawn. Another couple mentioned how their visiting niece had been asked to leave the community pool because she didn't look like she belonged. One story after another, each dripping with the same passive-aggressive tone disguised as concern. Karen hadn't just targeted us. She'd been doing this for years. But now, people were starting to talk because someone had finally pushed back. They saw the envelope. They saw the process server. They saw Karen's sudden silence. And they realized something had changed. Still, the HOA board tried to pretend it was business as usual. They sent out their monthly newsletter with updates on landscaping, a reminder about trash placement, and a cheerful message about maintaining community harmony. My wife highlighted that section, screenshot it, and added it to her case file. Harmony, she noted, was often the excuse given for silencing dissent. For them, harmony meant obedience. She also requested a full record of all fines and warnings issued by the HOA in the past 2 years. When they refused, citing privacy concerns, she filed a formal request under State Homeowners Association transparency laws. The HOA president replied nervously, offering instead to set up a private meeting to clarify any concerns. She declined. She wanted a paper trail, and she was creating one. The final piece came when she pulled Karen's name from the county records and found that she wasn't even the official HOA president anymore. Her term had expired 3 months earlier. She had no legal authority to issue warnings, file complaints, or call for votes. She was acting on pure assumption, and everyone else had just gone along with it. That revelation became the cornerstone of the report. It showed not only discrimination, but outright misconduct, someone operating without authorization, using the HOA as a personal weapon. Once the draft was complete, my wife didn't rush to file. She sent a courtesy copy to the HOA's legal representative. It wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity, a chance to fix things before it escalated further. But it came with terms: Karen's resignation from the board in any capacity, a formal apology for the harassment and false reporting, and a community meeting to address fair enforcement of HOA policies moving forward. She gave them 5 business days to respond. The shift was immediate. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood for several days. Her name was quietly removed from the HOA email list. A new board meeting was announced, and for the first time, it was open to residents for public comment. Apologies weren't public, but they came in emails, in notes, in awkward conversations on driveways. Some people meant it. Some were just covering themselves. But it didn't matter. The culture had cracked. The fear was gone. The silence had been broken.